A charming man came to my little Minnesota town and promised every retiree in it a guaranteed 12% return on their savings. No risk. And one by one, my friends, my neighbors, the widows from my church handed him everything they had. And he was so warm and so confident and so successful looking that nobody wanted to be the rude one who asked the hard question. Nobody except me. Because I am a boring old man who taught high school math for 30 years. And the very first time Gavin Royce said the words guaranteed and 12% and no risk in the same breath, I knew, the way I know 2 + 2, that he was a liar. Because that number cannot exist. The math simply does not allow it. But I didn't say so. I didn't stand up and warn everybody, because I'd have just been the sour old teacher nobody listens to, and Gavin would have smiled and moved his poison somewhere else and started over on some other town full of trusting people. So instead, I did something that frightened my daughter half to death. I let Gavin Royce believe that I was the easiest, richest, loneliest mark he'd ever found. I let him think he was about to take everything my late wife and I saved in 40 years of a teacher's salary, plus my house. I made myself the biggest fish in his pond, on purpose. And I dangled there. And I kept him in my town long enough for some very serious people to quietly walk in the back door. He thought he was reeling in a foolish old man. He never once considered that the foolish old man was the bait, and that I had done the math on exactly how this was going to end. My name is Gene Halvorsen. I am 69 years old. I taught algebra and geometry and, my favorite, a unit on compound interest, to about 4,000 teenagers in a small town in central Minnesota. And on the side, I coached JV basketball for 20 years. Badly. I am, by any measure, a nobody. A quiet widower in a paid-off house, which is exactly the kind of man a predator like Gavin Royce drives past slowly and licks his lips at. If you're listening tonight, maybe a retiree who watched a smooth talker move through your church or your club or your neighborhood, promising the impossible, and felt that cold worry in your gut while everyone around you clapped, then you already understand the thing I'm about to tell you. Stay with me to the end and tell me down in the comments where you're listening from, because the part that matters happens at a fancy dinner Gavin himself threw. And I want you at the table. Let me start with the slide rule. Because my wife is in this story, even though she's been gone 3 years. And the slide rule is how, when I started teaching in 1978, my Lorraine bought me a slide rule. They were already going out of fashion. The calculators were coming in. But Lorraine found me a beautiful old one, and she had it engraved. And the engraving says, "The numbers don't lie. Gene." That was her line about me, half teasing and half proud. She used to say it at parties. Gene can't tell a fib to save his life, and he can't stand one either. Because the numbers don't lie, and neither does he. I kept that slide rule on my desk for 30 years of teaching, and it sits on my desk at home now. And I have held it more in the last 3 years than in the 30 before, because holding it is a way of holding her hand. You'll hear about it again. It is, in a way, the whole reason Gavin Royce is where he is today, instead of in some other town, doing this to some other widow. A man can talk his way past your heart, and past your manners, and past your loneliness. But he cannot talk his way past a number. And Lorraine spent 40 years making sure I'd never forget that. Lorraine and I were never going to be rich, and we knew it the day we married, and we didn't care. A teacher's salary and a school nurse's salary, 2 kids, 40 years, but we were savers, the both of us, children of people who'd been through hard times, and we did the boring, unglamorous, magnificent thing that compound interest rewards, which is, we put a little away every single month for 40 years, and we never touched it. By the time I retired and Lorraine passed, that patience had turned into a real nest egg. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to live on carefully and leave something to the kids and the grandkids. Every dollar of it was an honest dollar, saved slow, and it represented 40 years of Friday nights we didn't go out and vacations we didn't take. I want you to understand what that money was, because it's what Gavin Royce smelled from a mile away. It wasn't just money. It was the proof that two ordinary people had lived a careful, faithful life. And a man like Gavin looks at 30 years of somebody's careful faithfulness and sees only a number he can take. And I want to be plain about something, because I think it's the part people get wrong about men like me, men who get taken. They think we're greedy or stupid or both. We're not. The thing a predator actually hunts isn't greed, it's fear. After Lorraine died, I started waking up at 3 in the morning doing a kind of math I'd never done before. The worst math there is, which is how many years do I have left times how much does it cost to live times what happens if I live longer than the money does. Every retiree in my town was doing that same sum in the dark, and it terrified all of us. Because none of us had ever made enough to be sure of the answer. And that fear, that decent, ordinary, 3 in the morning fear of being a burden, of running out, of dying broke after a lifetime of doing everything right. That is the soft spot a man like Gavin presses on. He doesn't sell you riches, he sells you the end of that fear. He sells you a good night's sleep. And there is almost nothing a frightened old person won't hand over for the promise of a good night's sleep. After Lorraine died, I was lonely, in a way I didn't have the arithmetic for. The house was too quiet. And, like a lot of widowers, I leaned harder into the things that were left. The church, the coffee group at the diner, the retired teachers who still got together. The whole web of ordinary community that holds an old man up when the main beam of his life is gone. And that web, that beautiful, trusting, small-town web, is exactly the thing Gavin Royce came to harvest. Because predators like him don't pick a town at random. They pick a town like mine, full of decent people who trust each other. And they get in through the trust, not around it. That's the part nobody tells you. The thing that makes a good community good. That everybody vouches for everybody. That a friend's friend is automatically your friend. Is the exact same thing that makes it a perfect hunting ground. He didn't break our trust from the outside. We handed it to him from the inside, person to person, with a smile. He got in through my friend, Lyle. Lyle is a good man, a retired shop teacher, one of my oldest friends. And I want to be careful how I say this, because Lyle is not a villain in this story. Lyle is a victim, who didn't know it yet. And the cruelest thing Gavin did was turn good men like Lyle into his salesmen without them ever realizing. Here's how it works. And it's the oldest trick there is, dressed up in a nice suit. Gavin shows up, meets a respected man like Lyle, and lets Lyle invest a modest amount. And then Gavin pays Lyle his guaranteed 12%, right on schedule. Beautiful returns, real money in Lyle's account. Lyle is thrilled. Lyle tells everybody. Lyle, in complete good faith, becomes the most effective salesman Gavin could ever hire. Because Lyle isn't selling. Lyle is just an honest man telling his friends about a good thing that's happening to him. What Lyle didn't know, what none of them knew, is that the 12% Gavin paid him wasn't earned anywhere. It was just some other retiree's savings, handed back to Lyle with a bow on it. That's the whole machine. It's called a Ponzi scheme, and it is 200 years old, and it works on the one thing that never goes out of style, which is a person's wish to believe that this time, for them, the impossible thing is true. So Lyle, beaming, brought me to a dinner Gavin held at the nice restaurant by the lake, and I want to tell you about Gavin Royce, because you need to understand that he was good at this, genuinely good. The way I was good at explaining a parabola. He was about 50, handsome, warm, beautifully dressed but not flashy, the picture of quiet success. He drove a car that whispered money instead of shouting it. He listened. Lord, could he listen? He'd lean in and ask about Lorraine, about my teaching, about my grandkids. and he'd remember every name, and you'd walk away feeling like the most interesting man in the room. He talked about his fund the way a pastor talks about grace. This proprietary strategy, this special access, this thing that let regular, hard-working folks finally get the kind of returns the rich people always kept for themselves. He said the words safe 100 times. He said guaranteed. He said 12%. And around that table, I watched my friends, smart people, careful people, lean toward him like flowers toward the sun. Because he was offering them the one thing every retiree lies awake terrified about, which is the certainty that the money won't run out before they do. And I want to be fair to my friends, because you might be sitting there thinking, how could grown adults fall for this? Let me tell you how. They fell for it because it didn't come from a stranger on the telephone. It came from Lyle, whom they'd known for 40 years, and from the widow in the third pew who was already getting her checks, and from the man at the next table who just put in his second round. It came wrapped in every face they trusted. Gavin himself barely had to sell anything. He just had to be charming and patient and let the community do the selling for him. Neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend. Until saying no didn't feel like prudent skepticism. It felt like calling your friends fools, and like missing out on the one good thing everybody you loved was already part of. That is the genius of it, and the evil of it. He didn't ask people to trust a stranger. He turned their trust in each other into the rope. By the time he got to me, half the people I loved were already happy, already telling me I'd be crazy to sit it out. The pressure on me wasn't Gavin. The pressure was a whole community of good people, smiling, holding the door of the burning building open and waving me in. And I sat there, the boring old math teacher, and I did the arithmetic, the way I'd done it on a chalkboard 4,000 times. And I want to tell you exactly what I knew, in my bones, before the dessert came. A guaranteed return means no risk, but return comes from risk. That is the most basic law there is. The first thing I taught every September. The only truly guaranteed, risk-free things in this world pay you maybe 4 or 5% in a good year. So if a man offers you 12% guaranteed with no risk, he is promising you something that cannot be bought anywhere on God's earth. Which means one of two things. Either he has discovered a brand new law of the universe that every bank and every government and every genius on Wall Street somehow missed and decided to share it, for free, with retirees in a small Minnesota town. Or he is lying. And the only place that 12% can possibly be coming from is the pockets of the next people through the door. There is no third option. The math does not allow a third option. And the moment I understood that, I understood that everyone I loved in that room was already standing in a burning building. And most of them had just signed the lease. I almost said it, right there. I almost stood up and ruined Gavin's dinner and yelled, "Fire!" And I'm glad now that I didn't, because it wouldn't have worked. And here is the terrible reason why. When you tell a person who has just handed over their life savings that they've been conned, you are not giving them information, you are giving them a wound. And people protect themselves from wounds. They wouldn't have heard a warning. They'd have heard a bitter old man, jealous, negative, raining on the one good thing to come along in years. And they'd have closed ranks around charming Gavin to protect themselves from the awful thing I was saying. I'd have been the villain, and Gavin would have patted my friend's hands and agreed that some people just can't be happy for others. And he'd have walked off cleaner than ever. A warning, this late, doesn't save people. It just isolates the one man who could. So I went home to my too quiet house. And I sat down with Lorraine's slide rule, and I did the hardest math of my life, which was not about percentages. It was this. I could simply protect myself. I could politely decline, keep my savings safe, and let the building burn with everyone I loved inside it. And no one would ever blame me, because I'd done nothing wrong. Or I could try to put the fire out, which meant doing something that scared me to my core. Because the only way to stop a man like Gavin, the only way to actually save Lyle and the widows and all of them and get their money back, was to give the authorities something they could act on before he vanished. And the only way to do that was from the inside, as a believer, as a mark. The fire couldn't be fought from where I was standing, safe in the doorway. Somebody had to walk back into the building, and I was, God help me, uniquely qualified. Because I was the one man in that town who could play the perfect fool while being absolutely certain of the truth. So that's what I decided to do. At 69 years old, 3 years a widower, I decided to make myself the bait. The next morning, I did 2 things. First, I called Gavin Royce, and I poured it on. And I'll admit a small dark part of me enjoyed it, because I had spent a lifetime being the honest man who can't tell a fib. And now, for the only time in my life, lying was the right thing to do. I told him that dinner had really gotten me thinking, that since Lorraine passed I'd been waking up at night just sick with worry about outliving my money, that I had a fair amount sitting in boring old accounts earning nothing, and even, I let it slip like an embarrassed confession, a paid-off house I'd started to wonder about putting to work. Because what's a house to a man with no wife to share it? I made myself into the exact silhouette he was hunting. A lonely, frightened, trusting old man. Cash-heavy and counsel-poor, with no sharp-eyed spouse left to talk him out of a single thing. And I heard it happen on the other end of the line. That tiny shift in his voice. The stillness of a fisherman who has just felt the big one bump the line. He'd found his whale. From that day, he called me Gene in a soft, warm, intimate way, like we'd been close for years. And he started folding me into the special small dinners, the inner circle, the 8 or 10 he was working hardest. And every time he did, he brought himself a step closer to the edge he couldn't see. And the second thing I did was, I called the state. Not the local police, who'd have been out of their depth, but the securities division at the state. The people whose whole job is exactly this. It took me a few calls to get past the front desk to someone who'd really listen. A sharp, no-nonsense investigator named Maddox. And when I finally laid it out, the guaranteed 12%, the recruiting, the lack of any real statements, the way the returns were obviously coming from new money. Maddox got very quiet, and then very interested. Because this was the part I hadn't understood, and Maddox confirmed it. The state knew predators like Gavin existed. What they almost never got was a credible insider, a sane and careful witness, willing to stay close and document the thing from the inside while it was still happening, instead of a pile of weeping victims showing up after the money was already gone and the man was already in the wind. I wasn't just reporting a crime. I was offering to hold the door open from the inside. Maddox told me, plainly, it could be dangerous to my own money, and it would take patience and nerve, and asked if I understood what I was signing up for. I said, I taught teenagers algebra for 30 years. I have patience and nerve to spare. I'll tell you the part where I nearly lost my nerve. Because I did. More than once. The hardest part wasn't Gavin. Gavin was easy. Because I felt nothing for Gavin but the cold focus you feel toward a problem on a board. The hardest part was Lyle, and the widows, and all the good faces. For weeks I had to sit across from my oldest friend at the diner while he glowed about his returns and pushed me, lovingly, to get in deeper before the fund closed to new money. And I had to smile and nod and pretend, knowing that the beautiful returns he was so proud of were nothing but the savings of some widow 2 pews over, handed back to him with a bow. And knowing that when this came down, Lyle was going to have to carry the weight of having walked the wolf into every house he loved. I wanted so badly, so many times, to just lean across that diner table and tell him, and keeping it from him, lying to my friend's face every morning over eggs for his own good, felt some days like its own kind of betrayal, and I'd drive home sick with it. And then there was the deeper fear, the one that came at night. Because there were nights I sat at my desk with Lorraine's slide rule in my hands and thought, who do you think you are? Gene Halvorsen. You are a retired math teacher and a bad JV coach. You are not a lawman. What if you have miscalculated? For once in your life, what if you're wrong and you blow up a good man's legitimate business and your friend's one good thing out of nothing but a sour old widower's suspicion? And you spend your last years as the bitter crank who couldn't stand to see anybody happy. That doubt was vicious. And it was vicious precisely because everybody around me was so visibly, genuinely happy. And I was the only sour note in the whole bright song. It is a desperately lonely thing to be the one person in a warm room who can see the cliff that everyone is dancing toward. But then I would do the only thing that has ever steadied me. I'd hold Lorraine's slide rule, and I'd turn it to the lamp and read her engraving. The numbers don't lie. Gene. And I would remind myself that what I felt was not suspicion at all. Suspicion is a feeling, and feelings can be wrong. What I had was arithmetic. 12%, guaranteed, no risk, is not a thing I distrusted. It is a thing I knew to be impossible, the way I know a triangle can't have four sides. And arithmetic, when I am careful with it, is the one thing in this entire world I have never once in 69 years been wrong about. And every morning, on the strength of that, I'd put on a cardigan and go let Gavin Royce believe he was robbing a fool. It took Maddox and the state a few months to build it, quietly, the way you have to. They needed the records, the bank trails, the proof that the money paid to the Lyles was coming straight from the pockets of the newcomers and not from any real investment anywhere. And my job, my only job, was to keep Gavin warm, keep him in town, keep him greedy, keep him believing that the biggest payday of his run, my whole nest egg and my house, was just a few weeks away. So I strung him along, the way you string along a child who wants dessert. Always almost ready to sign, always one more reassurance away. I asked him slow, dumb, careful questions. Can I see it in writing, Gavin? Just so an old man understands. And I watched him smile and deflect every single time. Because of course, there was nothing to put in writing. There was no fund. There was just him and a list of victims and a checking account. Every deflection I reported to Maddox. I was, at 69, the most boring and most effective informant the state of Minnesota had that year. The last move happened at the biggest dinner Gavin ever threw, an investor appreciation gala, he called it, at the fanciest event hall in the county. He'd rented the whole place. It was, I understood later, his victory lap and his setup for the next, bigger round of recruiting. The night he'd parade his happy investors in front of a room of fresh prospects, and the night, he believed, that I was finally going to commit everything. He told me to come ready to make it official. He had no idea that Maddox and the state had spent that week getting exactly what they needed, and that the people I'd brought as my guests were not the curious neighbors he assumed. I want to tell you about that room, because I've thought about it every day since. Gavin up at the front, glowing, in his element. My friends at the tables in their good clothes, proud and happy. The widows from my church laughing. Lyle beaming at me from across the room, so glad his old friend Gene was finally getting in. And me, in my one good jacket, with Lorraine's slide rule in my pocket, where I'd carried it the whole time, for luck and for her. Gavin worked the room like a king, and then he came to me, warm, conspiratorial, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Gene, are we ready to take care of you tonight?" And I looked at this man who had spent months planning to steal 40 years of my Lorraine's careful faithfulness. And I said, "You know what, Gavin? I think tonight's the night the numbers finally catch up with us." And then Maddox and the others stood up from their tables. I had brought them in as my guests, you see. 3 quiet people in good clothes, that nobody looked at twice in a room full of retirees. And Gavin, glowing, working the crowd, had walked right past them a dozen times that night, had probably even shaken their hands, never dreaming that the state of Minnesota was eating his shrimp cocktail. That was the part I'd given them. A con man's whole defense is that he can always run. The instant he smells trouble, he's gone. A new name in a new state, starting over on new victims, and the money's gone with him. The only way to catch a man like that is to have the trap already closed before he knows he's standing in it. So my job, the boring old math teacher's job, had been to keep him so sure of his victory, so certain that tonight was his big payday and I was his big fish, that he'd stand still in his own spotlight long enough for the door to lock behind him. And he did. He stood right there, beaming, his hand on my shoulder. The king of the room. At the exact moment it became a cage. I won't dress it up into a movie, because it wasn't. It was quiet and procedural and almost gentle, which somehow made it worse for Gavin. There was no shouting. Investigators simply moved to the front of the room and identified themselves, and informed Gavin Royce, in front of every soul he'd been robbing, that his accounts had been frozen that afternoon by emergency order, that the fund was the subject of a state and federal action, and that he was not going anywhere. And I watched the room change in stages, the way a room does. First, confusion. Then, on my friends' faces, the dawning, the terrible math finally doing itself in their own heads. The realization of what frozen accounts and the word fraud meant about the returns they'd been so proud of. And on Gavin's face, last of all, I watched the mask I'd been studying for months finally come all the way off. And here is the thing about what was underneath, the thing I'll carry to my grave. I expected to see panic, or rage, or even fear. What I saw was nothing, a flat, cold, almost bored nothing. In that instant, with his whole world ending, Gavin Royce did not look like a man who'd been caught doing something terrible. He looked like a man recalculating his odds, already wondering which lawyer to call and which state to start over in. There was no remorse in him because there was nothing in him for remorse to live in. I had spent 30 years looking into the faces of teenagers, watching them feel guilt and shame and growth, watching souls get built. And I realized, looking at Gavin, that I was seeing the opposite. A place where a soul was supposed to be and simply wasn't. He'd hollowed himself out so he could do this work, and the hollowing was permanent. And God forgive me, the only thing I felt, looking at the emptiest man I'd ever seen, was a kind of cold pity. Not for what was happening to him, for what he'd made of himself to get there. Here is the last move under the last move. When the dust settled, I could have stood up and taken a bow. The local paper wanted the hero, the retired teacher who took down the con man. And there was a real temptation, at 69, after a life of being a nobody, to finally be a somebody. I turned it down. I asked Maddox to keep my name out of it as much as the law allowed, and I'll tell you why. Because this was never about me being clever, and the second it became the Gene Halvorsen story, it stopped being the thing that actually mattered, which was getting my neighbors their money back and warning the next town. The state's emergency freeze caught most of the money before Gavin could move it, and over the next long year, with a lot of paperwork and a lot of patience, most of those families got most of their savings returned. The widows from my church, the retired teachers, all of them. Not everyone got everything. Some wounds don't fully close. But the building did not burn all the way down. And that was the only trophy I ever wanted. And Lyle, I went to Lyle myself, before the news broke, because I was not going to let my oldest friend find out from a stranger or a headline what he'd been part of. I sat him down in his own kitchen and I told him everything, what Gavin really was, what I'd done these months while smiling across this very table from him, and what was about to happen to all of it. And Lyle, this good and gentle man who had carried the wolf to every friend he had, without ever once knowing it was a wolf, came apart in front of me in a way that frightened me. The guilt of it nearly broke him. He kept saying, "I brought him to them. Gene, I brought him to all of them. I'm the one who told them it was safe." And I sat with my friend at his kitchen table while he shook, the way you sit with a man whose whole foundation has just cracked under him. And I said the truest thing I know, and I'll give it to you too, because somebody listening tonight needs it. I told him, "Lyle, you did not bring them a wolf. You brought them a thing that was wearing a friend's face, and you believed it because believing your friends is the whole of who you are. The only thing you're guilty of is being a man who trusts the people he loves. And if you let that man, that empty man, talk you out of being that, then he really will have taken everything. Because that trust is worth more than all the money in that room. I am not going to let him have it." It took Lyle a long, hard time, but he's all right now. We still have coffee at the diner most mornings, the two of us, two old teachers, and neither one of us has put $1 into anything more thrilling than a certificate of deposit since, and we never will. And we laugh about that, finally, which is how I knew he was going to be okay. So here is what I'll leave you with tonight. Wherever you're listening from, the men who come to take everything you have are not going to look like wolves. They are going to look like the most successful, the most generous, the warmest person you've met in years. And they are going to come to you through somebody you already trust, because that is the door they use. And they are going to offer you the one thing you want most: certainty, safety, a guaranteed good thing in an uncertain life. And the offer is going to feel like a kindness. So here is the only protection I know, and you don't need 30 years of teaching math to use it. When a thing is guaranteed and safe and pays far more than safe things pay, it is a lie. Every single time, with no exceptions. And the warmer the man saying it, the faster you should count. Be the person who asks the rude question. Be the one who wants it in writing. Be willing to be the sour old skeptic at the happy table. Because the predator is counting on every one of you being too polite, too trusting, too afraid of being rude, to simply do the math. The numbers don't lie. People do. Learn to tell which one is talking. If a charming stranger ever came to your community, offering the impossible, tell me about it down in the comments, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read every one. If this was worth your time, subscribe and ask the rude question, and get it in writing. And remember that the most dangerous words in the English language, spoken warmly enough, are guaranteed and no risk.